Hey everyone, it's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and today I am reviewing the TRUTHEAR Zero Red. The Zero exists thanks to a collab with a big player in the IEM review space, Crin, hence that little logo in the top right corner. Now I'll have a link in the description below to check out his YouTube channel as well as his website because he has a massive IEM database. You probably already know who Crin is, but just in case you don't, I strongly suggest checking it out. He's known for hilarious yet extremely informative content. He's kind of a legend in the IEM space, so him working on an IEM himself to releasing it to the masses, putting his name on it, says a lot about the product and how confident he is in the performance. So Crin spent about 10 months working on the Red. The Red is the second iteration of the Zero. He had a collab that he did with TRUTHEAR in the past. That Zero was $50, this one's $55. The old one was the color blue, so that's an easy way to tell which one it is in case you don't know which one to buy. But basically with the Red edition, it's a $5 increase as a result of the R&D in the improved materials. You also get a funny little base impedance adapter that I'll talk about here shortly. So they improved the voice coils and the crossover, and as a result, even at medium or moderate volumes to extreme volumes, the end result is lower distortion. So you get a cleaner sound reproduction and higher power handling. You can push these up to about 115 decibels or higher without any real distortion, which is a lot of decibels. I strongly do not suggest to hit that level, but it's good to know they play to that. It bodes well for the long-term reliability and clarity depending on what you're listening to. Now, in addition to reducing the distortion and increasing power handling, they also changed the tune compared to the original Zero. So this is like a more refined, laid-back version of the original Zero. The bass being less forward may sound like it's a more neutral IEM. It's neutral to an extent, and especially if you're not using the impedance adapter, but because this uses a dual dynamic driver system, it still has gorgeous, thunderous bass, especially if you want it to. Now, Crin did send this to me for review. It won't affect what I say about it, but I just want to share that. So I have no kickbacks or affiliate links or anything like that. It's just to create an honest review and share this product with my viewers, you all, so thank you for checking it out. I've met Crin last year at a headphone show and have talked to him a few times on Discord. He's an amazing dude and he's super knowledgeable, like I said. So huge thanks to Crin for sending this. It won't change what I say about it, but I want to get that out there. Now, in addition to getting the IEMs, of course, in the box, you get a few accessories to go with it. You get 7 pairs of tips, and basically you have 3 pairs of sizes. So you get the small, medium, large, and then you have a small bore versus a large bore. It does affect the upper mid-range slightly, along with the treble performance, just at least what's perceived. So I would experiment, even if you pick one over the other, maybe try the other one anyway, just in case you like how it sounds. And then you have a memory foam, like a squishy little marshmallow material, which fits most ears. So depending on your preference, you can do that, or of course you can buy your own tips online if you like spin fit or something else. Also included is a little leather pouch, which kind of opens funny. It's almost like a basket or a bowl. So it opens up into a little cube and you can stuff the IEMs in there and obviously your little impedance adapter. It feels nice. It's actually a nice little leatherette, but at least it keeps them safe from getting scratched. You get this black glossy braided cable, and this cable, so it's obviously not shielded or anything, and it has this little adjustable choke. It's kind of grippy because of the gloss finish on it. So the only critique or feedback I had on the cable, it performs fine. I had no issues there, but it tends to not untangle itself as easily as some other IEM cables I've used. So that would be my only nitpick. Otherwise, from a audibility standpoint, you know, microphonics, all that is excellent. I had no problems with it. And then you have this impedance adapter, which is basically a 10 ohm resistor. And the reason why this works the way it does, it basically gives you a 3 decibel bass lift, but not by boosting bass. What happens is this is a dual driver system. You have a 10 millimeter woofer and a 7.8 millimeter full range driver. The way this is built is the woofer has a different impedance than the full range driver, and I'll just keep it simple in that regard. So what happens is when you add 10 ohms to that, the ratio is affected differently for total resistance, and as a result the woofer is less affected by adding resistance to it. So what you're really doing is you are reducing the mid-range and to treble region because of the 10 ohm resistor, and as a result, because the bass isn't impacted as much, you end up getting a bass boost, or basically you're tilting the IEM downwards. So if you are missing some warmth or punch that you want or crave, just add this guy in and it's going to give you that bass lift you're looking for. Now from a build quality standpoint, they feel great. I mean, I don't abuse my IEMs and I haven't owned these for more than a month, so I can't speak to the, very long-term reliability or build quality, but they are 3D printed resin. They have this like glue application process with this gorgeous red ribbon. These are honestly a really nice looking IEM, but a lot of the time it really comes down to personal preference. There is some depth to this like woven fabric that's behind this resin, and to me it just adds a little bit of depth to it. It's not like it's just a red paint job. So I like that. And this is using a resin based mold. It's a 3D printed mold. I usually prefer this because it feels nicer on my skin. It's smoother and it doesn't have the same thermal properties as a metal IEM. Metal IEMs are obviously nice and durable. They're dense. They tend to weigh more, but this fits really nice as far as resting against my ear. I didn't mention this before, but it is a 2-pin 0.78 millimeters, so you can always swap the cables out if you like. Naturally, it's detachable. Now, what's different from this IEM to many others in this price range is the bore size, which is the opening of the IEM, where all the sound's coming from. This is about 1 millimeter wider than many IEMs in this price range. I have 6.8 millimeters on the top opening here, if you can see that on the screen. And then if I go down to the inner part, it's just about 5.9 millimeters. I mean, this is just going off my caliper. So the Moondrop LAN are 5 millimeters on the inner part and 5.8 on the outer. So it's a full millimeter difference. That's like a 15% increase in width. Now, usually when you get dual dynamic driver IEMs like this, especially with good bass performance, the bore size tends to be a little bit large. This feels good to me initially because of their ergonomic shape and the way the hooks are. The hooks are really nice as well, actually. I like the way they hold my ear. It could be maybe about, I don't know, a few millimeters tighter around the loop, but it's nothing, too bad. I get a really secure fitment every time I put it on. The issue though is the bore size for me sneaks up on me after a while. I'd say as little as like 20 to 30 minutes, I do feel that width, and the memory foam would help, but I have like a skin reaction to these memory foam tips. So I usually use Spin Fit, but the stock tips, this is fine for me to wear for a while, but if I'm doing like a plane ride and I'm wearing these for 3 or 4 hours, the bore size is a little bit too big for me. So that's the only real critique I can have as far as comfort goes. Now these are extremely easy to drive. Normally I'll have a section to where I talk about my source gear, but they're rated at 17.5 ohms with 117 decibel sensitivity rating. And then impedance is plus minus 15% because it depends on your load and frequency. However, with that kind of sensitivity, you can drive this with anything. I used a $10 Apple dongle and it got louder than I was comfortable listening to. So don't feel like you have to invest in a really expensive player to get the most out of these. That's really important because it's a $55 IEM and I wouldn't want to feel like I have to invest into a $50 or $100 DAC just to enjoy what they're capable of doing. So the reason why I also call out the sensitivity is when you add a 10 ohm resistor to it, the impedance adapter, you are reducing its sensitivity, which means you have to turn it up, 1 or 2 more notches to compensate. And because this is so sensitive and easy to drive in the first place, I can still, even with a $10 Apple dongle, get this IEM extremely loud, and then you reap the benefits of the extra bass. Now, because impedance adapters do reduce your sensitivity and therefore lower your volume, this is also why Crin didn't do a higher impedance adapter in the box. You can always buy these online and go with a higher impedance. They sell ones that go up to 600 ohms, which is going to make a big difference on your total output. So you don't need to go to that extreme, but if you want even more bass from a passive standpoint, you can always do a 20 ohm resistor or something like that. They just didn't do it because the more you add resistance, the harder it is to drive, and for people just plugging it into a phone or a $10 dongle, now it gets to an area where it may not be loud enough, and I don't think they want to deal with returns or negative feedback because of it. So moving over to sound quality, I want to start with the objective stuff first and talk about measurements, and then I'll get into the subjective side and how I perceive the sound. So you have 2 different frequency response curves, basically, the sound characteristics or tune that this IEM has. And I did it this way because I didn't want to show you just a bass lift. I wanted to show you how this affects the output when you add the impedance adapter. So without the impedance adapter are the 2 top lines. And you can see that if you look at the bass line, which is this little line right here, and compare it to the treble, your treble and upper mid-range is surpassing the bass. So you have a little bit more neutral, clean sound. This tune, by the way, is exceptional. It sounds absolutely amazing from a frequency response standpoint and tonality standpoint. When you add the impedance adapter, the bass is reduced just slightly because again, you're adding 10 ohms, but now you can see the mid-range is just below the line of the peak bass note. So this is how the impedance adapter is affecting your sound. It's not so much lifting bass, like I said, it's reducing everything else. And this little hump right here that you can see right about the 175 hertz mark, that's the crossover from the woofer to the full range. So he explained in one video, I think it was 160 to 180 hertz where it's crossed over, and I'm seeing, mid 170s. So that kind of, lines up with that. The only thing I want to point out with my unit is I had about a 0.6 decibel variance from my left and right driver, and that was consistent. I cleaned up this part of the measurement just to show you the left and right with and without bass boost, but the left driver was always about 0.6 decibels louder than the right. At least it was consistent. I could always EQ that, but that's such a minor change. It didn't really affect the imaging to me personally. It still was close enough. I just want to point out how mine measured. So naturally, after looking at those measurements, it's safe to assume these things sound pretty good. And you'd be correct if you assume that. The tonality is just ridiculously good. And what that means is it sounds natural. It voices that you're familiar with. If you listen to the same stuff over and over, if you're testing IEMs because you're into this hobby too, you know how certain songs should sound. And this is reproducing that in a very accurate and honest way. Now, because the bass is lifted slightly and it's pretty much all in the sub bass region, it's not coloring instruments that shouldn't have extra bass or warmth to it. Pianos still sound the way they should. Guitars still sound the way they should. Danny Carey from Tool ripping on the drums. It sounds insane. I don't have to EQ anything. Even without the impedance adapter, there's so much bass hit that bands like Tool can still sound incredible. Even though that looks fairly neutral to some other IEMs out there, don't underestimate the ability of what these do as far as the bass impact and performance goes. Now, as much as I love the bass performance, because again, I typically prefer a sub bass boost and not so much into the mids, because doing that jacks up the mids. So as a result, the mids are actually my favorite thing about the Red, because I listen to so many different genres. And I think that's an important takeaway here is you can have an IEM that has an insane bass shelf and even does carry into the mids. And as a result, certain songs can sound insane. But then you listen to other songs that shouldn't have that, and it's colored and almost ruined. So this is just one of those tunes that when the song calls for it, especially on the bass side, it can do it. But at the same time, if you are listening to something more neutral and laid back, whether it's an acoustic or you just listen to some vocals, etc., this is still going to sound the way it should. I have a lot of tracks that I listen to that I'm really familiar with, and I know how those tracks are supposed to sound. And the fact that you can get a $55 IEM that absolutely crushes it and leaves no question of how that song should have sounded is pretty remarkable. Now I want to touch on treble briefly before I get into the whole technicality and resolution thing, and I will talk about gaming. The treble, because this is reserved a little bit compared to the original one, it's not as airy or bright. It has a safer tune. And this is what I prefer, because at lower volumes, or depending on what you're listening to, yes, that elevated upper mid and treble might be something you desire. You can always EQ this to do that, by the way. However, there are songs that are not as forgiving, and they are either sibilant themselves or really harsh sounding depending on the age of the recording and how it was mastered. So this type of tune, again, just like how they tune the bass, is safer on the treble side. It still has good air and extension in the upper frequencies, but it sounds a little bit darker than some IEMs. When you compare this to something like the Moondrop Land, which is $40, and I absolutely love the Moondrop Land. The Land has a leaner, thinner bass note, but also has a slightly more forward vocal presentation, and that does carry a little bit into the treble. So if you feel like, let's say you own the Land and you want something a little bit softer, a touch more bass presentation, the Red's going to do that for you. Now, I mentioned the characteristics of the treble being kind of a little bit more reserved and tame, and that is also the same with the technicality and resolution side, the detail retrieval. This is not a knife's edge reproduction of sound. It's smooth. it does not have the same speed or attack and decay that some other IEMs do. I feel like the Moondrop Land is just a little bit more resolving, but not, it's just because it's a different tune. It's more forward in that 2 kilohertz range, so it sounds like it's more detailed. But ultimately, this isn't like an overly excited, dynamic, punchy, alive sound. It's tame, it's softer, and as a result, like I said with the treble, it can be more forgiving that way. So if you were trying to add some zing to the music and make it sound as dynamic and detailed as possible, this may not do that, but where it does excel is the tonality. And I would always lean towards preferring having a good tonality and accurate representation of music before needing or approaching that level of detail. If you need that, honestly, you tend to spend more on like, $200 IEMs to get this level of tuning performance and then still carry better resolution. Now, I mentioned the Moondrop Land already from a tuning perspective. It's basically just a lighter bass, a little bit more vocal forward. That uses a single dynamic driver and does not have the same power handling that these do. If you want I would say the opposite of the Red, and I'm not saying it from a bad tuning perspective, but purely for resolution, I found the SimGot EA 500s, which I think are about $80. Those have incredible resolution. They represent everything, but it can be too forward and harsh sounding to some people, and they don't have the same bass impact that these do. So if you want something that's a bit opposite, I would go as far as considering something like that. So gaming now. This is my favorite sub $100 IEM I've used for gaming so far. Now, a good IEM or headphone is going to have pretty comparable performance from a gaming perspective to an extent, because ultimately you want them to have similar driver matching from an imaging standpoint in case you're a competitive player. The soundstage is part of it for FPS, but don't expect really wide open sound stages with an IEM. This does not have a wide soundstage. It's a little bit more compressed, but again, it still sounds natural. What is really cool about how these perform for gaming is because this is using a dual driver system. There's a woofer handling the deep frequencies, and then you have your mid-range and treble for with the second driver. As a result, when you get into a complex scene, and this also affects macro dynamics, so if you're listening to a really busy song that has a lot of bass and a lot of detail going on, having a dual driver system spreads the workload out. So even though the woofer is doing its thing, it's not affecting the mid-range or mid-driver's ability to reproduce all the other stuff. They can work freely from each other, and as a result, you always get a more coherent, clean sound. That whole thing that Crin was talking about with the reduced distortion, that translates heavily into complex songs and games. So what makes these special, because you can just plug this into a controller, for example, if you're not doing EQ, you benefit from immersion by having sub bass. So explosions actually have bass to it. But because there's a dual driver system, you can still easily hear footsteps. So from an FPS perspective, that's incredibly important. These do perform noticeably better than my Moondrop Lands did on gaming, just for that reason alone. You can of course custom EQ stuff, but this is one of those times where you can still be rewarded with immersive bass, which is amazing for open world RPG games, that type of thing, and then go jump on an Apex or Call of Duty and have some sweats and still be competitive even with a $55 IEM. So that about wraps up the review of the Red. I think the Red's special because if a family member or friend said, hey, I have $50 for an IEM, or 55, what do you recommend? And if I can't ask them questions on what they're looking for in an IEM, the Red is a safe choice. Because it has just the right amount of bass, mid-range, and treble, it's a safe tune that's not going to be offensive to anybody, but I also don't think people are going to hear it and feel like they're missing something. The only two criticisms I have really, but again, this is just, you have to choose what you're willing to sacrifice, is the bore size is a little bit larger, and that can lead to some discomfort. And these aren't a very lively, energetic sounding IEM. I don't want to say they're dead because they're not, but they are a little bit more compressed and less analytical, I guess. But I still would much rather prefer the tonality and tuning of this because I can listen to everything and just enjoy it. It's kind of like just plug and forget. So I do love the Reds. I think in this price range, it's still the top pick, or it has to be up there for the top. Second pick would be the Moondrop Land for $10 less if you're okay with losing some of the bass power handling and you want just a little bit more forward mid-range if you want the upper vocals to stand out more. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button. I talk about a lot of IEMs gaming and other audiophile products I'd love to see at the next video. With that being said, thank you so much for the support. I'll see you next time. Bye.